Biology students, this is a video lesson on Section 5, Aquatic Ecosystems. Whereas in Section 4, we learned about terrestrial biomes. In this section, you're going to be learning about some of the major aquatic ecosystems we find on our planet. So what you'll be able to do by the end of this video lesson is you should be able to describe what factors affect life in aquatic ecosystems, describe the major categories of freshwater ecosystems, explain why estuaries are so important, and lastly, explain how ecologists classify marine ecosystems. You can see there are some key terms you'll be due for our next class. So what are some of the conditions that affect life underwater? So we know that aquatic organisms, whether they're fish or microscopic organisms or plants, they are affected primarily by the depth of the water, temperature, water flow, and the amount of dissolved nutrients, most specifically for plants or plant-like organisms such as algae. The reason why water depth is important is because light can only penetrate to a certain depth in the water column, and as light travels through the depths of a water column, it begins to diminish to the point where there may not be enough light or maybe no light for photosynthesis. We call the area from the surface towards the bottom, whether it's the ocean or a lake, we call that the photic zone. So ponds, for example, light penetrates all the way to the bottom, so the entire water column is the photic zone. However, in a deep lake or more specifically the ocean, light can only penetrate to a certain depth, and we call that the photic zone, where photosynthesis can take place. The aphotic zone is that part of the ocean or a large water body that does not receive light, so therefore we do not see photosynthesis at that particular depth. Organisms that live on the bottom of a water body, whether it's a lake or an ocean or a pond, we call that the benthos, also called the benthic zone. So that is an area where there may be light penetrate to the bottom, so we may have plants there, or there may not be light, and therefore there's generally less organisms found in the benthic zone. And of course, water temperature will vary by latitude and by the depth of the water. So as we travel through the water column, the surface waters are generally warmer from the radiant energy of the sun, but as we go deeper and deeper and deeper within a lake, for example, a deep lake, as we get to the bottom, it may be very cold, and that's going to have an effect on the amount of life that's found at that depth. And of course, oxygen dissolved in water is also a problem. As we go deeper in the water column, we find less oxygen near the bottom than at the top, due again to the fact that there is no photosynthesis occurring there. Now, in freshwater ecosystems, roughly 3% of the Earth's surface is covered by fresh water. We find that water trapped in rivers and streams, lakes and ponds, and freshwater wetlands, and we'll go over a couple of those different systems in this slide. Now, for rivers, the source of water for a large river system, and sometimes a stream, is what we call the headwaters. That may be at a higher altitude, higher elevation, I should say. But generally, when we look at the source for a river or a stream, the headwaters, it's generally colder water. The water runs much faster, as you can see in the top pictures here, on higher levels of oxygen. All that churning of the water, we get a lot of oxygenation. But as we begin to travel downstream from the headwaters of a river or a stream, we start to see the water begins to slow down. The depth of the river may get deeper. It gets wider. Therefore, there's more warm water can be held in that large river system than in the upper headwater regions of that system. So it looks quite a bit different, generally less oxygen, warmer water, and the types of organisms that live there will be different than in the headwaters of a river system. So those are considered moving waters. Waters that are fairly slow moving to stagnant, or what we call lakes and ponds. Not that they're stagnant necessarily, but there's certainly less water flowing through lakes and ponds. But within a lake or within a pond, what's a little different than in, say, a river is that heat and oxygen may circulate from top to bottom, and nutrients certainly fall from the surface waters to the bottom, which may support rooted plants or certain types of plankton. So generally speaking, in a pond, as you see in the bottom picture here, you see the lily pads along the bottom, versus a deeper lake is what we're showing in this picture here. You can kind of see the mountains in the background, so we're assuming it's a colder, maybe more oxygen found there than in the small pond here that's generally shallower, warmer, less oxygen. So that's going to have an effect on the types of organisms found in that lake or pond. So generally speaking, lakes are large bodies of water where the light does not penetrate to the bottom. Ponds are water bodies where light does penetrate to the bottom. And therefore, there's going to be more photosynthesis, more productivity in a pond than in a lake. but larger, deeper lakes generally will have a little bit more oxygen. They'll be a bit colder compared to a warmer pond. There is a video. We're not going to take a look at it in this slide, but I would like you to take a look at this on your own time. It's a little bit about riverine or river food web. So there are a number of videos as we go through this slide presentation. So on your own, I'd like you to take a look at some of those videos. Wetlands are another category of aquatic ecosystems, defined as areas of land that are covered with water at least a part of the year. So that's really important to note. Some examples of wetlands are marshes, which generally see kind of marshes along the edges of large water bodies, bogs, which are generally water bodies that are very, very stagnant. In other words, water comes up from the groundwater system and fills in that space, but water does not circulate through a bog. Unlike a swamp, which actually water does flow through a swamp, which is a wetland that can have a number of trees found within in that aquatic ecosystem, and vernal pools, and there's a video on vernal pools in the next slide here. Wetlands are essential and critical habitat for many species of wildlife. You can see the ducks kind of beginning to land here in this wetland area. So we see that wetlands are an area for breeding areas for many different types of duck species. And then other animals are going to, fish species will move into wetland areas to breed. So really critical for wildlife. We know that wetlands help to kind of filter the water. That plants living in the wetland will literally take some of the nutrients and some of the toxic substances out of the water. So water flowing into a wetland may have some pollutants in it, but as the time it flows out of the wetland, those pollutants may be removed. So that makes wetlands really critical areas for life. And in terms of some of the differences, marshes are distinguished from swamps by the lack of trees. Marshes, you'll see more grasses in a marsh, such as the edge of a bay or the edge of a large lake. But a swamp certainly can have different types of trees within that area. And historically, what we've done with wetlands is we've found them to be somewhat areas that lack human significance. We'll drain them, we'll fill them in, and we'll develop it. We'll put a shopping mall. We'll put a huge theme park like Disney World in Florida. Was really built on top of wetlands. And today we have more wetland laws than ever before to protect them, so that, for example, if an area must be developed in a wetland area, it'll be a requirement for those building over top of that wetland that they'll have to recreate that wetland somewhere else, which is not an easy task to do, but it is important that we protect wetlands for all the different great ecosystem services that they provide. So this is a video about what is a vernal pool. So again, please take a look at this. You can find these notes in Google Classroom. And estuaries. So an estuary is defined as an ecosystem in which fresh water from a river mixes with salt water from the ocean. So these are really important areas. You might know them as a bay, such as Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, or Chesapeake Bay in Maryland and Virginia, Delaware Bay, which of course is where the Delaware River flows into the ocean. Estuaries are one of the most important and most productive aquatic ecosystems out there. In other words, it holds a lot of life. This mixture of freshwater and saltwater is a really important area for organisms. And generally, estuarine waters are nutrient rich. In other words, the water that flows downstream in a river and ends into a estuary, a bay, for example, or a sound, are going to have a lot of nutrients that will promote plant growth, algae growth, and that can help support a really rich food chain. Now, salinity, which is the amount of salt found within that water, is going to vary throughout the estuary. The closer we get to where the river meets the estuary, it'll be less salt, versus where we now transition near the ocean will be more salt. Roughly speaking, the ocean holds about 35 parts per thousand salt, meaning that for every 1,000 particles, 35 of them are salt, NaCl. So an estuary can range anywhere from 0.5, which would be considered pure fresh water, to 35 parts per thousand. And of course, all organisms have different tolerance levels for salt water. So true saltwater oceanic organisms can live in high salt conditions, but however, freshwater organisms don't do well in high salt conditions. And some animals can make that transition from living in the ocean to living in freshwater, such as the American shad that travels up the river every spring. So many of these estuaries are important breeding grounds for various fish species. So therefore, it holds really important significance for a lot of large fish populations that will travel in the estuaries, breed there, and they'll leave, and then their young will move back out into the ocean. One of the more important types of plants that we find in estuaries are submerged aquatic vegetation, grasses of different types. We call them SAVs. And the loss of them due to human boat traffic, due to all sorts of activities, and more specifically, algae growth beginning to kind of cover the grasses and killing them. We're losing a lot of these submerged aquatic vegetation beds, and that's a great area of concern because it's really home for a lot of different life forms. Some of the threats to estuaries are sewage effluents. In other words, the treated sewer water leaving a sewage treatment facility can impact these estuaries. Agricultural runoff in many areas, farms of pig farms. I'm thinking most specifically in Chesapeake Bay, have had a dramatic impact on the water quality in the Chesapeake Bay area. Shoreline development, building homes, of course, chemical pollution are all major threats to estuaries, which again are really important breeding grounds for many different types of fish species. And again, here's a video of some work done by Rutgers University students in southern New Jersey in an estuary that you should take a look at. And lastly, marine ecosystems. We might know them as the ocean. And typically, as we study the ocean, we can break it into different zones based on the depth of the water and the distance from the shore. Every shoreline is a little bit different, depending on what continent we're looking at, but these zones are still the same. And you can see a picture of those different types of zones here in this top picture. So the first area that we look at in a marine ecosystem would be considered the intertidal zone. New Jersey, it's a little less dramatic than maybe in some northern areas like Maine and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. Our intertidal zone looks a little different, but generally speaking, it's the area between the highest tide mark and the low tide mark. And of course, as you well know, tides move in and out throughout the day. We have 2 low tides and 2 high tides per day. So animals that live in the intertidal zone have to be able to either withstand a little bit of exposure to air during that low tide period or being completely submerged during the high tide time period. Unless, of course, they're able to move on their own. But some animals are sessile, meaning they stay in place. So therefore, they have to be able to sometimes be exposed to air, which would tend to dry them out, or other times being completely submerged. And a lot of crashing of waves can make the intertidal zone kind of a rough place to live. As we move from the intertidal zone, we move into what's called the coastal zone, which extends from the lowest tide mark out to the edge of the continental shelf. Where is that deep, quick drop off of shoreline. And of course, in the Atlantic Ocean, the continental shelf is much farther away from the shoreline. In the Pacific Ocean, it's much closer to the shoreline. So no matter what continent we are found studying, there's always going to be that drop off. You can kind of see that coastal ocean where we're moving out towards the drop off of that coastal zone. At that point, we now are in the open ocean. And we know that, again, within the open ocean, there's going to be that photic zone from the surface down to a depth of roughly 200 to 300 meters where light can penetrate. Once we get to that point, now light is diminished to the point where there may be no light at all, especially at the bottom of the ocean. That would be the aphotic zone. And within that photic zone, we're going to find certainly we will find more life in the photic zone than in the aphotic zone. However, as I have here in the notes, the photic zone contains fewer species because of the lack of nutrients. In other words, in the open ocean, the further we get away from the land, there's going to be less nutrients because all the nutrients are really coming from the land, meaning runoff from rivers or runoff from literally coastal areas, carrying nutrients for plant growth, for algae growth. So without those nutrients, you're not going to find a whole lot of life out in the open ocean. Enough that if you were to kind of take the mass of all that life, would be quite tremendous. But per unit area, there's going to be less life in the open ocean than compared to coastal areas. But again, we do find photosynthesis in the photic zone, so we'll find more productivity in the surface waters of the open ocean due to that characteristic. And then as we move to the deeper parts of the world's oceans, we start to find these weird communities. Most specifically, the picture down here at the bottom, you kind of see in the background here like a little cloud, it looks like right here. This is an underwater volcano, a hydrothermal vent. A vent is an opening in the crust of the ocean, of the Earth's surface here, in this case underwater, and it's releasing various chemicals that bacteria living in the tissues of these white worms here are going to use to make sugars, just like in photosynthesis. Instead, we call this chemosynthesis, where they're using chemicals from their environment to help create sugars that they can then pass on to the tissues of these worms. This we consider a mutualistic relationship, which we've learned about. And believe it or not, we find some really kind of crazy, really unique communities of life in the deepest parts of the world's ocean where there's no light, simply because chemosynthesis can take place there. But also as materials fall from the surface waters to the bottom, that also can provide a little bit of nutrients. But marine ecosystems certainly offer a lot of different opportunities to do really interesting studies, whether it's in the intertidal zone, in the coastal zone, or certainly out in the open ocean. And the last video here talks a little about life in the ocean zones, most specifically the intertidal zone. So please take a look at that video. And that is it for this video lesson on section 4.5 in aquatic ecosystems.